The morning Detroit woke up to silence was the morning everything changed forever, and Marcus Webb knew something was dead wrong before he even opened his eyes. The usual symphony of car horns, garbage trucks grinding through their routes, and neighbors shouting at each other was just gone, replaced by a quiet so thick it felt like the whole city was holding its breath. Marcus sat up in his cramped studio apartment, rubbing the sleep from his dark eyes, his instincts from 2 tours in Afghanistan screaming that danger was close, real close. He was 32, built like someone who hadn't forgotten what a battlefield looked like, with close-cropped hair and a scar running along his jaw that he'd gotten in Kandahar. The digital clock on his nightstand blinked 6:47 a.m., but the world outside his grimy window looked like someone had pressed pause on the whole damn city. Marcus threw on his jeans and a faded army t-shirt, walking to the window with the kind of caution that becomes second nature when you've survived IEDs and ambushes. What he saw made his blood run cold in a way combat never had. The street below, usually packed with folks heading to work or the corner store, was empty except for a handful of figures moving wrong, all jerky and mechanical like broken puppets. One of them was Mrs. Henderson from 3B, the sweet old lady who always baked cookies for the building, except now she was stumbling down the sidewalk with her head tilted at an angle that would have snapped a normal person's neck. Her nightgown was covered in dark stains, and when she turned toward a passing car, Marcus saw her face had gone gray, her eyes clouded over like spoiled milk. The car didn't stop, didn't even slow down, just kept rolling through the intersection before crashing into a telephone pole with a crunch of metal that echoed through the empty morning. "What the hell?" Marcus muttered, his mind already shifting into tactical mode, assessing threats and escape routes without even thinking about it. He grabbed his phone off the charger, but the screen showed no signal, no bars, nothing but a blank emergency alert notification that had failed to load. The television was equally useless, just static on every channel except one local station that was playing the emergency broadcast signal on loop. Marcus felt his chest tighten because he'd seen enough FUBAR situations to know when the whole system was collapsing. He moved away from the window and started gathering supplies with the efficiency of someone who'd trained for worst-case scenarios, stuffing a backpack with canned food from his sparse pantry, bottles of water, a first aid kit he'd assembled himself, and the Glock 19 he kept in his nightstand along with 3 magazines of ammunition. His military training kicked in hard, overriding the panic that wanted to flood his system, focusing him on survival and strategy. The building was too quiet as Marcus moved into the hallway, the kind of quiet that meant either everyone had already left or something much worse had happened. He knocked on his neighbor's door, a college kid named Tyler Rodriguez who was always blasting music at ungodly hours, but got no response except for a shuffling sound behind the door that made the hair on Marcus's neck stand straight up. "Tyler, man, you good in there?" Marcus called out, pressing his ear to the door. The shuffling got louder, followed by a wet, dragging sound and a low moan that didn't sound human at all. Marcus backed away slowly, his hand instinctively moving to the pistol tucked in his waistband, every survival instinct telling him to get the hell out of this building right now. He took the stairs instead of the elevator, moving quick but quiet, checking corners like he was clearing a building in Fallujah, and that's when he heard the screaming coming from below. The lobby had turned into a nightmare that would have made Hollywood proud, except this was real and the blood pooling on the cracked tile floor wasn't corn syrup and food coloring. 3 of those things, those zombies, or whatever the hell they were, had cornered a woman near the busted front entrance. She was maybe mid-20s, wearing scrubs like she was a nurse or something, with blonde hair pulled back in a ponytail that was coming loose as she swung a piece of broken chair at the advancing figures. Her face was streaked with tears and grime, and she was screaming for help in a voice raw with terror. Marcus didn't hesitate because hesitation got people killed, and he'd lost enough buddies to know that every second counted. He pulled his Glock and fired 3 controlled shots, the sound deafening in the enclosed space, each round catching a zombie in the head and dropping them like strings had been cut. The woman stumbled backward, eyes wide with shock and relief, her chest heaving as she tried to process what had just happened. "You bit?" Marcus barked out, keeping his weapon ready as he scanned the lobby for more threats. The woman shook her head frantically, holding up her arms to show clean skin beneath the torn sleeves of her scrubs. "No, no, I'm clean, I swear to God I'm clean," she gasped out, her voice shaking but steadier than he'd expected. Marcus nodded and grabbed her arm, pulling her toward the exit. "We gotta move, now. This whole place is gonna be crawling with those things in minutes." They burst out onto the street where the morning sun was just starting to burn off the early fog, revealing a city that had gone to hell overnight. Cars were abandoned in the middle of streets, some still running with doors hanging open like their drivers had just vanished. Fires burned in the distance, sending columns of black smoke into the sky, and the moaning, that god-awful moaning of the undead, echoed from every direction like some kind of hellish chorus. The woman's name was Jessica Montgomery, and she told Marcus her story as they moved quickly through the back streets, avoiding the main roads where the zombie population seemed thickest. She'd been working the night shift at Detroit Memorial when everything went sideways around 3 in the morning. Patients started coding all at once, then getting back up with those dead eyes and attacking anyone close enough to grab. Jessica had watched her colleagues get torn apart, had hidden in a supply closet for 2 hours before making a run for her apartment building, only to find it wasn't safe either. She was tough, Marcus could tell, the kind of tough that came from dealing with life and death situations in the ER, but this was a whole different level of crazy. "I saw Dr. Patterson get bit and turn in less than a minute," Jessica said, her voice hollow with shock. "One minute he was trying to help a patient, the next he was eating an orderly's face. It doesn't make any sense, none of this makes any damn sense." Marcus kept them moving, using his military training to navigate the urban terrain, sticking to cover and avoiding open spaces where they'd be exposed. They passed bodies in the street, some dead for real and some that would probably get back up soon, and Marcus made sure to put a round in the head of any that looked too fresh. "Conserve ammo," Jessica said quietly, noticing his dwindling magazine. "We don't know how long this is gonna last." She was right, and Marcus appreciated that she could think tactically even with her world falling apart. They ducked into an abandoned pawn shop when a group of maybe 20 zombies shuffled past, pressing themselves against the wall behind a display of guitars and amplifiers, barely breathing as the horde moved by with that distinctive dragging shuffle. Marcus counted them, assessed their speed and coordination, noting that they seemed to respond to sound more than sight, tracking movement and noise like predators that had been stripped down to basic instincts. The pawn shop owner was still there, sort of, slumped behind the counter with a shotgun in his lap and the top of his head missing. Suicide, Marcus figured, deciding to check out on his own terms rather than let those things get him. Marcus felt a pang of something like understanding because he'd known guys who'd made similar choices when the darkness got too heavy. He gently took the shotgun from the dead man's hands, checking the load and finding 4 shells still in the tube. Jessica found a baseball bat behind the counter, gripping it like a lifeline, her knuckles white but her jaw set with determination. "We need a plan," she said, looking at Marcus with eyes that demanded honesty. "We can't just keep running around out here. We need somewhere safe, somewhere we can figure out what the hell is happening." Marcus agreed, his tactical mind already working through options and scenarios. The city was a death trap, too many people packed too close together, which meant too many zombies now. They needed to get somewhere defensible, somewhere with supplies and a way to see threats coming. He thought about the old National Guard armory on the east side, a fortress-like building he'd visited a few times for training exercises. It would have weapons, ammunition, food, medical supplies, and walls thick enough to keep out a small army of the undead. The problem was getting there, cutting across 3 miles of zombie-infested city with limited ammunition and no idea what they'd find when they arrived. "I know a place," Marcus told Jessica, pulling out a paper map from the pawn shop's dusty rack because GPS and phones were useless now. "National Guard Armory, about 3 miles east. If anyone's organizing a defense, that's where they'll be." They left the pawn shop through the back door, emerging into an alley filled with dumpsters and the smell of rotting garbage that almost masked the sweeter, sickly smell of rotting corpses. The journey east became a nightmare obstacle course of death and survival, every block presenting new horrors and challenges that tested their courage and quick thinking. They found a group of survivors holed up in a corner grocery store, 5 people including a couple with their teenage daughter, an older man who looked like a Vietnam vet based on his tattooed forearms, and a young guy who couldn't have been more than 20. The family's name was Thompson, Bob and Linda with their daughter Emma, and the vet introduced himself as Frank Castellano while the young guy was Danny Kim, a college student who'd been studying engineering before the world ended. Bob Thompson was a big dude, probably worked construction or something similar, with hands the size of dinner plates and a protective stance around his family that Marcus respected. Linda was rail-thin and nervous, clutching her daughter like she might disappear if she let go, and Emma was maybe 16 with the kind of shell-shocked look Marcus had seen on civilians in war zones. Frank was old-school tough, probably mid-60s but still solid, with sharp eyes that missed nothing and an old M1911 pistol tucked in his belt. Danny was scared but trying to hide it, holding a kitchen knife like he had some idea how to use it but not much practical experience. "Y'all need to come with us," Marcus said, explaining his plan about the armory. "This store ain't gonna hold when they really start pushing against those windows." There was some debate, some arguing about whether moving was more dangerous than staying put, but Frank sided with Marcus immediately. "The soldier's right," Frank said in a gravelly voice that carried authority. "This is a temporary position at best. We need real fortification, real supplies." "I'm in." Bob looked at his wife and daughter, then at the groceries around them, doing the math in his head. "How do we know this armory ain't already overrun?" he challenged, but Marcus could tell he was already convinced, just needed to voice his concerns for his family's sake. "We don't," Marcus admitted, "but we know for damn sure that staying in a building with big glass windows and one exit is a guaranteed death sentence. At least the armory gives us a fighting chance." That settled it, and the group started preparing to move, gathering supplies and weapons, turning into a small squad with Marcus naturally taking point. The expanded group moved slower but safer, able to cover multiple angles and watch each other's backs as they navigated the increasingly dangerous streets. Danny surprised everyone by being useful, his engineering brain kicking in to help them navigate around obstacles and blocked streets, finding paths through buildings and over fences that kept them away from the largest zombie concentrations. Emma stayed close to her parents, quiet but observant, and when a lone zombie stumbled out of a doorway reaching for her mother, the teenager didn't hesitate to crack it across the skull with a pipe she'd picked up. Linda gasped and pulled her daughter close, but Marcus saw the look in Emma's eyes, that hardness that came from doing what needed to be done to survive. "Good hit," he told her quietly, and Emma nodded, her jaw tight but her hands steady now. They were 2 miles from the armory when they ran into the horde, a massive concentration of zombies, had to be 100 or more, filling the street like a nightmare parade. The group ducked into an abandoned apartment building, racing up the stairs to the 3rd floor as the moaning mass below shifted toward the sound of their movement. "We're trapped," Linda whimpered, looking around the dingy apartment they'd barricaded themselves in. "We're gonna die here." Marcus moved to the window, his mind racing through options and scenarios, and that's when he noticed the building across the street was close enough that the fire escapes almost touched. It was risky as hell, but sitting here waiting for the dead to figure out where they'd gone was a guaranteed death sentence. "We're gonna jump," Marcus announced, and everyone looked at him like he'd lost his mind. Frank got it first, moving to the window and measuring the distance with his experienced eyes. 6 feet, maybe 7, he said thoughtfully. "Doable, if you got the nerve." Bob looked at his wife and daughter, then at the gap, and Marcus could see the fear warring with necessity in the man's face. "Emma can't make that," Bob said flatly, but Emma surprised them all by speaking up. "Yeah, I can. I ran track last year. I can make it." The determination in the teenager's voice was fierce, and Linda looked like she wanted to argue but knew they didn't have a choice. Marcus went first, backing up and taking a running start before launching himself across the gap, his military training making it look almost easy. He landed on the opposite fire escape with a clang of metal, immediately turning to help the others across. Jessica came next, the athletic nurse clearing the gap with room to spare, then Frank, who moved with surprising agility for his age. Danny hesitated, looking down at the street below where zombies were starting to cluster, drawn by the noise, but Marcus's voice cut through his fear. "Don't look down, look at me. You got this, brother." Danny ran and jumped, barely making it, his feet slipping on the edge before Marcus and Jessica grabbed his arms and hauled him to safety. Emma went next, her track and field training evident in her form as she sailed across the gap and landed smoothly. Bob helped Linda onto the window ledge, holding her hands as she prepared to jump, and Marcus could see the terror in the woman's face. I can't do this," Linda said, shaking her head, but Bob's voice was firm and loving. "Yes, you can. I'm right behind you. On 3. 1, 2, 3. Linda jumped and didn't quite make it, her body slamming into the fire escape railing with a painful crunch. Marcus and Jessica grabbed her arms while Bob screamed from across the gap, and for a terrible moment, Linda's weight was pulling her down toward the street of reaching dead hands below. Marcus's shoulders screamed in protest as he hauled with everything he had, and Jessica was cursing up a storm as they pulled Linda up and over the railing. The woman collapsed on the metal grating, gasping and crying, but alive and unbit. Bob made his jump look easy despite his size, clearing the gap with a foot to spare and immediately gathering his wife in his arms. "You're okay, baby, you're okay," he murmured, and Marcus gave them a moment before getting everyone moving again because those zombies below had definitely noticed them now. They made it to the armory by early afternoon, exhausted and running on adrenaline and fear. The building was a squat concrete fortress that looked like it had been designed to withstand a siege, which was exactly what they needed right now. The main gate was closed but not locked, and Marcus felt hope surge in his chest as they slipped inside the perimeter fence. The compound was quiet, too quiet, with no signs of military personnel or other survivors. The group moved cautiously across the vehicle yard where several Humvees sat idle, approaching the main building with weapons ready. Marcus tried the door and found it unlocked, which set off alarm bells in his head because the military didn't leave armories unsecured. The interior was dark and cool, emergency lighting casting everything in a dim red glow that made shadows jump and dance. They found the first bodies in the main hallway, 3 National Guardsmen who'd been torn apart by something vicious and brutal. Frank checked them professionally, making sure they weren't going to get back up, while Marcus led the group deeper into the building. The armory had been ransacked but not completely cleared out, with weapons still locked in the main vault and supplies scattered throughout the storage rooms. Someone was here, Jessica observed, noting the pattern of the chaos. They took some stuff but left in a hurry. Marcus agreed, finding evidence of a hasty evacuation or escape, papers and equipment left behind in mid-use. They found the security office and Marcus managed to get the backup generator running, bringing lights and power to their section of the building. The group spent the rest of the day securing their new home base, barricading entrances, and cataloging supplies with the methodical efficiency of people who knew their survival depended on being organized. Danny found the communications room and started trying to get the radio equipment working, hoping to make contact with other survivors or any remnant of government authority. Frank and Bob worked on the physical defenses, using their combined construction and military experience to reinforce doors and windows. Jessica set up a medical station in what had been the armory's aid room, taking inventory of supplies and making lists of what they'd need. Emma helped her mother cook a meal from MREs and canned goods, the smell of hot food raising everyone's spirits despite the circumstances. That night, gathered in the armory's break room with the doors secured and watches set, the group finally had a chance to process what had happened. Marcus shared what he knew about zombie behavior from his observations, how they seemed to track by sound and movement, how headshots were the only reliable way to put them down permanently, how they seemed to be spreading through bites and maybe other bodily fluids. Jessica added her medical observations about the rapid infection time and the way the virus or whatever it was seemed to shut down higher brain functions while leaving the brainstem active. Frank talked about Vietnam and surviving in hostile territory, lessons about rationing and discipline that would serve them well. Bob spoke about protecting family and keeping faith, his arm around Linda, who looked 100 years old but was still holding herself together. Danny got the radio working around midnight, scanning through channels of static and emergency broadcasts until he found a voice, an actual human voice, crackling through the speakers. "This is Colonel James Bradford, United States Army, broadcasting from Forward Operating Base Templeton, located at the former Michigan State Fairgrounds. If anyone can hear this message, be advised that we are establishing a safe zone for survivors. The infection is widespread but containable. Repeat, the situation is containable. If you can reach our coordinates safely, we offer food, shelter, medical attention, and protection. Do not approach the perimeter without announcing yourself. Use extreme caution. Bradford out." The message repeated on a loop, offering the first real hope the group had felt since this nightmare began. Marcus pulled out his map, locating the fairgrounds about 8 miles northwest of their current position. 8 miles. Through a city full of zombies, but with a real destination now, a place where the military was making a stand and organizing survivors. "We could make it," Bob said, studying the map over Marcus's shoulder. 8 miles is doable if we're smart about it. Frank nodded agreement, his old soldier's instincts approving of linking up with a larger military force. Jessica looked uncertain, torn between the security of their current fortified position and the promise of a larger survivor community. Danny was clearly excited about the prospect of more people, safety in numbers making sense to his analytical mind. Marcus let them debate for a while, understanding that decisions like this needed group buy-in to work. Emma was the one who cut through the discussion with simple teenager logic. "We can't stay here forever," she said quietly, and everyone turned to look at her. "We're just 9 people in a big building in a city full of those things. Eventually, our food runs out or they break through or we get sick or something else goes wrong. At least at the military base, there's more people, more supplies, more chances." The wisdom in her words silenced the group because she was absolutely right. Isolation might feel safe in the short term, but long-term survival meant community, meant pooling resources and knowledge, meant rebuilding something bigger than just this small group. They decided to wait until morning, rest and prepare properly for the journey ahead. Marcus organized the supplies they'd take, distributing weapons and ammunition so everyone was armed. Frank worked with Bob and Danny to prepare 2 of the Humvees, finding keys in the security office and checking that both vehicles were fueled and operational. Jessica packed medical supplies and helped Linda prepare food and water for the journey. Emma, showing more courage than most adults Marcus had known, volunteered for the first watch shift, taking a position at the upper window with a rifle and a radio to call if she spotted any threats approaching the perimeter. Marcus found himself unable to sleep, his mind running through everything that could go wrong on the journey to the FOB. 8 miles didn't sound like much, but in a city overrun with zombies, it might as well be 1,000. They'd need to move fast enough to avoid getting trapped but careful enough to not attract attention. The Humvees were tough but not invincible, and if they got stopped or surrounded, the armor wouldn't hold forever. He was still running scenarios when Jessica found him in the communications room, staring at the map like it might reveal some secret path to safety. "Can't sleep either?" she asked, settling into a chair across from him. Marcus shook his head, appreciating her quiet company. "Just thinking about all the ways this could go sideways," he admitted. Jessica nodded, understanding in her eyes. "You know what kept me going in the ER when things got crazy?" she asked. "Not thinking about all the patients waiting or all the things that could go wrong. Just focusing on the next task, the next person, the next moment. You take it piece by piece, and eventually, you make it through the shift." Marcus appreciated the perspective, recognizing the wisdom in her words. "One step at a time," he said, and Jessica smiled, the expression transforming her tired face into something warm and human in a world that had become cold and monstrous. Exactly. We get to the vehicles. We make it to the first checkpoint. We navigate around the horde. We reach the next checkpoint. Step by step until we're at the FOB. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, two survivors finding strength in each other's company, before Jessica headed to get some rest and Marcus took his turn at watch. The morning came too fast, dawn light filtering through the armory's high windows and painting everything in shades of amber and gold that seemed too beautiful for a world gone to hell. The group gathered their supplies, loading the Humvees with efficient coordination that spoke to how quickly they'd learned to work together. Marcus would drive the lead vehicle with Frank riding shotgun and Danny in the back operating the mounted radio. Bob would drive the second Humvee with Jessica, Linda, and Emma, providing medical support and backup firepower. They'd stay in radio contact, move together, and if one vehicle got into trouble, they'd both stop to help because leaving people behind wasn't an option any of them could live with. The streets of Detroit looked different in the morning light, less immediately terrifying but somehow more deeply wrong. Zombies wandered in clusters and alone, their gray-skinned forms shambling through a city that had been home to nearly 700,000 people just 2 days ago. How many of those people were dead now? How many had turned? Marcus tried not to think about the mathematics of the apocalypse as he navigated the Humvee around abandoned cars and bodies. Frank kept a running commentary of threats, calling out zombie positions and suggesting routes, his military experience invaluable. In the vehicle behind them, Bob drove with steady confidence, keeping pace and maintaining the safe distance Marcus had specified. They made it 3 miles before hitting their first serious problem, a massive pileup of vehicles blocking the main road with fires still burning in several of the cars. Marcus stopped the Humvee, assessing the situation with tactical eyes. The pileup was too big to ram through, and the surrounding buildings were dense urban construction with narrow alleys that might be impassable for their vehicles. We could backtrack, find another route, Frank suggested, but Marcus was already seeing the crowd of zombies emerging from buildings and side streets, drawn by the sound of their engines. No time, Marcus said shortly, making a command decision. We go through the alley on foot, bring the vehicles around the long way. It was risky, splitting up even temporarily, but the alternative was sitting here until the growing crowd of undead overwhelmed them. Marcus grabbed the radio and explained the plan to Bob, who acknowledged with professional calm despite the fear Marcus could hear underlying his words. They'd leave Danny with the vehicles to keep them running and ready, while the rest of the group moved through the alley on foot, clearing the route and making sure it was safe before bringing the Humvees around the long way. Danny protested being left alone, but Marcus was firm. You keep these engines running and you stay ready to move if things get hairy. You're our lifeline, brother. Can you handle that? Danny straightened up, recognizing the responsibility and the trust being placed in him. Yeah, I got this. You guys just hurry back. The group moved into the alley with weapons ready, Marcus on point with his Glock, Frank covering the rear with his M1911, Bob in the middle with the shotgun, and Jessica, Linda, and Emma clustered together with various melee weapons. The alley was narrow and dark, lined with dumpsters and fire escapes that created 1,000 hiding places for danger. They were halfway through when a zombie dropped from a fire escape above, landing on Bob with enough force to drive him to the ground. The big man yelled, wrestling with the snarling creature as it snapped at his face and neck. Marcus couldn't get a clean shot without risking hitting Bob, but Emma was faster, swinging her pipe in a brutal arc that caved in the side of the zombie's skull with a wet crunch. Bob shoved the twitching body off him, checking himself frantically for bites while Linda examined him with shaking hands. I'm good, Bob gasped, showing clean skin where the zombie's teeth had snapped inches from his throat. It had been too damn close, and Marcus felt his heart hammering as they helped Bob to his feet. The commotion had attracted attention, and zombies were stumbling into the alley from both ends now, closing in with their relentless shuffle and reaching hands. Move, now! Marcus shouted, and the group ran, emerging from the alley into a street that opened onto a park where the zombie concentration was thinner. They fought their way through a handful of the undead, Marcus dropping 2 with headshots while Frank took out another, and Jessica proved surprisingly vicious with a crowbar, crushing skulls with the focused efficiency of someone who'd crossed a line and wasn't going back. They circled back to find Danny exactly where they'd left him, the young man's face pale but determined as he tracked their approach. "Thought I'd lost you guys," Danny admitted, and Marcus clapped him on the shoulder. "Takes more than that to finish us off." They loaded back into the Humvees and took the long route around the pileup, adding an extra mile to their journey but keeping them moving toward their objective. The radio crackled with another broadcast from Colonel Bradford, this time more urgent. "All survivors, be advised that the safe zone perimeter is under pressure from infected populations. If you're coming to FOB Templeton, come now. We don't know how long we can maintain the security of this position. Bradford out." The message lit a fire under the group, and Marcus pushed their speed despite the dangers, weaving through the urban maze with Bob matching his pace vehicle for vehicle. They were within 2 miles of the fairgrounds when they encountered the roadblock, a deliberate barrier of vehicles and concrete barriers manned by soldiers in full combat gear. Marcus slowed, remembering Colonel Bradford's warning about approaching the perimeter carefully. He grabbed the radio handset and broadcast on the military frequency Danny had identified. "This is civilian vehicle November Mike 1, approaching your southern checkpoint with 9 survivors, requesting permission to approach. We are not infected, repeat, we are not infected." There was a tense moment of silence before a voice crackled back. "November Mike 1, this is FOB Templeton Checkpoint Charlie. Advance slowly with your hands visible. Any sudden movements and we will engage. Acknowledge." Marcus acknowledged and both Humvees rolled forward at walking pace, Marcus and Frank keeping their hands on the steering wheel and dashboard where the soldiers could see them. Bob did the same in the second vehicle, and Marcus could see at least a dozen rifle barrels trained on them from the checkpoint fortifications. They stopped at the barrier and stepped out slowly, hands raised, while soldiers in hazmat-style gear approached with weapons ready and what looked like medical scanners. The screening process was intense and thorough, the soldiers checking each of them for bites, taking temperatures, and running some kind of blood test with portable equipment before finally clearing them for entry. Colonel Bradford turned out to be a tall African-American man in his 50s with gray at his temples and eyes that had seen too much in the past few days. He greeted them with tired professionalism, shaking Marcus's hand and acknowledging Frank's military service with a nod of respect. "Welcome to FOB Templeton," Bradford said, his voice carrying the weight of command and exhaustion. "You folks made it through hell to get here. That takes guts and skill." He gave them the rundown on the situation, how the outbreak had started 4 days ago in multiple cities simultaneously, how the government had collapsed within 48 hours, how the military was trying to establish safe zones but losing ground every day. The fairgrounds had been transformed into a fortress and refugee camp combined, with military vehicles forming a perimeter wall, guard towers at strategic points, and tents housing maybe 300 survivors in the interior. It was organized chaos, with soldiers maintaining order while civilians tried to process their trauma and fear. Bradford assigned the group quarters in one of the larger tents and invited Marcus and Frank to a command briefing that evening, recognizing their military experience as valuable assets. Jessica was immediately recruited by the medical staff, her nursing skills desperately needed with the number of injured and sick survivors they were treating. Bob, Linda, and Emma stuck together, finding a corner of their assigned tent and trying to process the fact that they were actually safe, at least for now. That evening's briefing was sobering, Bradford laying out the strategic situation with brutal honesty. The zombie infection had spread globally, major cities had fallen worldwide, and communication with any central government had been lost. The military units that remained functional were scattered and isolated, each protecting their own small group of survivors with no larger coordination or support. FOB Templeton had maybe 2 weeks of food at current consumption rates, ammunition was plentiful but not infinite, and the zombie population surrounding their perimeter was growing daily as refugees brought hordes with them and the dead from the surrounding city concentrated on their position. "We need to consider relocation," Bradford said, looking at his assembled officers and advisors, which now included Marcus and Frank. "Somewhere rural, defensible, with agricultural potential for long-term survival. Marcus found himself part of the planning committee, his combat experience and clear thinking making him a natural fit for military leadership. He suggested several potential locations, rural areas upstate with farms and natural barriers, places they could defend with their limited numbers while building something sustainable. Frank backed him up, adding tactical considerations and practical wisdom from his Vietnam experience. A plan began to form, ambitious but possible, a convoy operation to relocate all 300 survivors to a location near Lake Huron where several small towns could be consolidated and fortified. It would be dangerous as hell, moving that many people through zombie territory, but staying at the FOB was a slow death sentence as their supplies dwindled and the undead population grew. Over the next 3 days, Marcus helped organize and plan the largest military operation he'd been part of since Afghanistan, coordinating supply distribution, vehicle assignment, route planning, and security protocols. Jessica worked around the clock in the medical tent, treating everything from injuries to infections to psychological trauma, becoming a familiar and comforting presence to the survivor population. Frank trained civilians on basic weapon handling and combat tactics, turning scared refugees into a minimally competent militia. Bob used his construction skills to reinforce vehicles for the journey, welding armor plates and protective barriers to civilian trucks and buses. Linda helped organize the children and elderly, making sure the most vulnerable survivors were accounted for and protected. Emma, despite her age, became a runner and messenger, her youth and energy making her perfect for moving quickly between different sections of the sprawling camp. Danny found his calling in the engineering section, working with the military techs to keep generators running, radios functional, and vehicles operational. His college education in engineering suddenly had real-world applications that could mean the difference between life and death. The kid thrived under pressure, proving that smarts and determination could be just as valuable as combat experience in the new world they were building. Marcus watched all of them grow and adapt, ordinary people finding extraordinary courage and capability when pushed to the edge, and he felt pride in the group he'd brought together, the family they'd become in just a few days of hell. The convoy departed FOB Templeton on the 7th day after Marcus's group had arrived, a massive column of military and civilian vehicles stretching for almost a mile. Bradford commanded from the lead Humvee, with Marcus riding shotgun and Frank coordinating the rear guard. The 300 survivors were distributed across buses, trucks, and personal vehicles, with soldiers interspersed throughout the convoy to provide security. They moved out at dawn, engines rumbling to life and filling the air with diesel smoke and the sounds of civilization fighting back against the darkness. The fairgrounds that had been their shelter for a week was left behind, empty and silent except for the zombies that would eventually breach the unmanned walls and find nothing but abandoned tents and spent shell casings. The journey north became an epic tale of survival and courage, the convoy fighting through hordes and obstacles, losing vehicles and people but pushing forward with grim determination. Marcus found himself in firefight after firefight, defending stopped vehicles and clearing roadblocks, his ammunition running low then being resupplied from the military trucks, the cycle repeating as they crawled northward. Jessica worked from a mobile medical station in one of the buses, treating wounded soldiers and civilians while the convoy rolled on, her hands steady even when the vehicle rocked from zombie impacts against the sides. The group that had started together stayed close, watching each other's backs and pulling each other through the worst moments. They lost Bob on the 3rd day of travel, the big man sacrificing himself to hold a doorway while his family and a group of children evacuated from a building they'd been forced to take shelter in during a storm. Marcus arrived too late to save him but was in time to hear Bob's last words, the dying man making Marcus promise to look after Linda and Emma. Marcus held Bob's hand as the light faded from his eyes, then put a round through his brain before he could turn, honoring the man's sacrifice with the only kindness left to give. Linda took her husband's death with devastating grace, her grief profound but her strength unbroken, holding Emma close as they mourned together and then kept moving because stopping meant death for everyone. The convoy reached Lake Huron on a gray afternoon 2 weeks after leaving Detroit, rolling into a cluster of small towns that offered everything they needed for long-term survival. Fields for growing food, forests for hunting and lumber, natural water sources, and existing infrastructure they could fortify and defend. The 300 survivors who'd made the journey, diminished from the 400 they'd started with but alive and together, looked at their new home with exhausted hope. Colonel Bradford stood before them that evening, outlined against the sunset over the lake, and delivered a speech that acknowledged their losses but celebrated their survival, their courage, their refusal to give up in the face of impossible odds. Marcus found himself settling into a new role as head of security for the settlement, working with Bradford and Frank to organize defenses and training programs. Jessica became the lead medical officer, establishing a clinic and training others in nursing and first aid. Danny and his engineering team set up power generation and water purification systems, giving the settlement the infrastructure for civilization. Linda, despite her grief, became a teacher for the settlement's children, giving the next generation education and hope for a future beyond just survival. Emma grew into a fierce and capable young woman, trained by Marcus in combat and tactics, becoming a scout and defender of the walls they built around their new home. The settlement, named Hope's Landing by popular vote, became a beacon in the darkness of the zombie apocalypse. They sent out radio broadcasts like the one that had saved Marcus and his group, offering shelter to survivors and coordinates for those brave enough to make the journey. More people came, sometimes alone and sometimes in groups, each with their own stories of survival and loss. The population grew slowly but steadily, reaching 500 souls by the end of the first year, then 1,000 by the end of the second. They cleared zombies from the surrounding area in systematic sweeps, built walls and watchtowers, planted crops and raised livestock, rebuilt something that looked like civilization from the ashes of the old world. Marcus never forgot the journey that had brought them here, the morning he'd woken up to silence in Detroit and discovered the world had ended, the people he'd lost and the people he'd saved, the courage and strategy that had seen them through impossible odds. He'd learned that survival wasn't just about weapons and walls, though those were important, but about community and hope, about ordinary people finding the strength to be extraordinary when everything was on the line. The zombie threat never fully disappeared, the undead remaining a constant danger lurking beyond the walls and in the abandoned cities, but humanity had faced the silent threat with courage and strategy, and they'd survived. Standing on the walls of Hope's Landing on quiet nights, Marcus would look out at the lights of their settlement, hear the sounds of children playing and people laughing, smell the smoke from cooking fires and see the farms stretching toward the horizon, and he'd feel something he hadn't felt since before the world ended: pride. Pride in what they'd built, in what they'd become, in the future they were creating one day at a time. The apocalypse had taken the old world, had killed billions and turned them into monsters, but it hadn't broken the human spirit, hadn't destroyed the courage and determination that made people fight for each other and for tomorrow. Jessica found him there sometimes, the two of them sharing watch duty and quiet conversation, a relationship growing slowly from shared trauma and mutual respect into something deeper and more meaningful. Frank trained the next generation of defenders, passing on his wisdom and experience to kids like Emma who'd never known the world before but were determined to protect the world they were building. Danny married a girl who'd arrived in one of the later survivor groups, an architect who worked with him to design and build better structures for their growing community. Linda saw her daughter grow into a leader and warrior, found peace in teaching and in knowing that Bob's sacrifice had meant something, had protected the future they were all building together. The settlement sent out expeditions to other survivor groups they'd contacted by radio, building trade networks and alliances, spreading the strategy and courage that had saved Hope's Landing to other communities struggling to survive. Marcus led some of those expeditions, bringing back survivors and supplies, sharing knowledge about zombie behavior and defense tactics, building the foundation for a new civilization rising from the ruins of the old. It was slow work, dangerous work, but it was work with meaning and purpose, every person saved and every community strengthened, another small victory against the darkness. Years passed, and the children born in Hope's Landing grew up knowing zombies as a constant threat but not an insurmountable one, learning to fight and farm, to build and defend, to value community and courage above all else. The settlement's walls expanded to encompass more land, more farms, more people, eventually connecting with neighboring communities to form a regional network of survivor settlements. Technology was rebuilt piece by piece, power grids restored in limited areas, radio networks expanded, even basic manufacturing resumed as engineers and craftspeople figured out how to work with the resources they had available. Marcus aged into the role of elder statesman, his hair going gray and his old combat injuries catching up with him, but his mind stayed sharp and his courage never wavered. He married Jessica in a ceremony attended by the whole settlement, Frank standing as his best man and Emma giving the bride away. They built a house together on the settlement's edge, close enough to the walls that Marcus could still keep watch but far enough inside that Jessica had a garden and space for the clinic she ran. They talked sometimes about the early days, the desperate flight through Detroit and the journey north, honoring the memories of those lost and celebrating how far they'd come. Colonel Bradford, promoted by popular consensus to Governor Bradford, led Hope's Landing with wisdom and integrity, building a government that was democratic but effective, civilian but organized, free but secure. He and Marcus remained close friends and advisors to each other, the civilian soldier and the military commander finding common ground in their shared commitment to protecting and building their community. Frank lived to see his 80th birthday, celebrated with a massive party where he told war stories and survival tales to rapt audiences of young people who saw him as a legend. He passed peacefully in his sleep a few months later, and the entire settlement mourned the loss of one of their founders and greatest defenders. The settlement that had started with 9 desperate survivors fleeing through a zombie-infested city had grown into a thriving community of thousands, a testament to human courage and determination in the face of the ultimate threat. Marcus would sometimes think back to that silent morning in Detroit, to the choice he'd made to fight and survive rather than give up, to help Jessica and gather the others, to push for the armory and then the FOB and then the journey north. Every choice had mattered, every act of courage had rippled outward, and the result was this, a new civilization rising from the ashes, built on the foundation of people who'd refused to give up. The zombie threat remained, probably would remain for generations, the undead a permanent fixture of the new world like wolves or bears, dangerous but manageable with the right precautions and strategies. Humanity had adapted, had learned, had survived, and was beginning to thrive again. It wasn't the world that had existed before, could never be that world again, but it was a world with hope and purpose, with communities and families, with children playing and crops growing and people building futures together. That morning when Marcus had woken to silence and found hell waiting outside his window, he'd made a choice to survive, and that choice had led to this moment, this life, this future. Standing on the walls of Hope's Landing with Jessica beside him, watching the sun set over Lake Huron while their settlement buzzed with life behind them, Marcus felt that bone-deep satisfaction that comes from knowing you've made a difference, that your life has meant something beyond just your own survival. The journey from that silent morning to this peaceful evening had been filled with horror and loss, courage and sacrifice, but it had been worth it because they'd built something that mattered, something that would outlast them and grow into a future worth believing in. Humanity had faced the silent zombie threat with courage and strategy, and while the battle wasn't over and might never truly be over, they'd won the war that mattered, the war for their own souls, for their humanity, for the right to build and dream and hope even in the darkest times. That was the thrilling survival journey that defined the rest of Marcus's life, and when he finally passed years later, surrounded by family and friends in a settlement that had grown beyond anything he'd imagined that desperate morning in Detroit, his last thought was simple satisfaction. We made it, we survived, we built something beautiful from the ashes, and it was worth every sacrifice along the way.